Today I am joined by Martin Mao, and we're going to talk about the three phases of observability. What are these three phases, Martin, and how are they different from the other three that people might have heard, which are the three pillars? What's the difference between them?
Perhaps I can give a little bit of context here before diving into what we think the three phases are. So if you look at sort of the evolution of the observability market, when you ask people what maybe observability is, perhaps the first answer that comes to mind is metrics, logs, and traces. And these are known as the three pillars of observability. They are the types of data that gets produced and used in observability solutions. And that is generally perhaps why a lot of folks focus on that part of the problem. If you think about a end user, an owner of a system, an owner of a piece of infrastructure, they don't necessarily think about the system in terms of logs, metrics, and traces, right? Those just happen to be artifacts that are produced that tell you about these systems. It's just so happens that these are the best formats to tell you about that information, but users don't really think about it. And yet we are so really obsessed about making sure that these systems produce these types of data, and producing more generally is perhaps better. And it's interesting because if you think about it from like a vendor's perspective, and here at Chronosphere, we're no different. The more data you produce, generally, the more somebody has to perhaps pay for that, either if it's a vendor or their own storage costs, right? So you can see why, as an industry, there's this push to have you to produce more data, and the focus about data production, because it's better for the players in the industry. However, if you look at it from the end user perspective, that's not necessarily true. So what we find is that, the growth, and I think we've done studies on this, the growth of the observability data is far outpacing the growth of a business. And not just that, it's the fact that, this data is growing 2 to 3x, maybe 4x year on year. The problem is you're not getting the return from that growth at all. So when you have 4 times the amount of data, it might cost you 4 times as much to pay to store that data. Yet when we ask, are you getting 4 times the value out of it, in which you may measure by 4 times the reduced MTTDs, MTTRs, people say no. In fact, often more data leads to worse time to resolution, time to detection, anything else. So there's a big mismatch there. And in our belief, the mismatch is because the focus is on the data production and not on the end users and what you're trying to do with it and the use cases. So the concept of the three phases is, if you take an approach from an end user and what they care about, they don't necessarily care. It's not that I produce metrics, hence I have great observability, or I produce traces, therefore I'm covered. Really, what you're trying to do when you're producing this data is really just do 3 things. The first thing in the first phase that we talk about is a notification. So can you be notified when something goes wrong? Because if you can't be notified when something goes wrong, you're not even in the game, right? You don't even know your systems are down. You don't know your customers are suffering. Can you be notified in a timely fashion that something is wrong? That's the first thing. And everything you can imagine around that, it doesn't matter what types of data you're producing. You can be producing logs, you can be producing traces. You don't have to produce all 3 types. Whatever you're producing, what is a way based on that data, you can get notified that something goes wrong. Like, that's the aim. It isn't to produce all 3 types, right? The second phase is the triage, because generally you get paged when something goes wrong. What you want to know is, what is the impact? Is this something, if you get paged, you can imagine in the middle of the night, is this something I can just snooze until the morning, or is it real big impact right now, right? Because often we set alerts when things like, a single pod fails, or a single host fails, or a single AZ fails perhaps. And the way we design modern distributed systems, it's tolerant of these failures in general. So triaging is really about understanding, what is the impact? Is there an immediate impact? Do I have to do something to fix the issue now? And what triaging also allows us to do on top of that is to help figure out how to mitigate that issue as well. So if I know that it's only this cluster, or if I know that it's only this particular AZ that's impacted, I can make short-term decisions to remediate the issue more than anything else. Not to root cause fix the issue, and we'll talk about that in a second. But you can imagine, if I know that it's a cluster and I've triaged the issue to just that cluster, there may be something I can do in the meantime, which is route my request to different clusters for now, and you can imagine that fixes the issue immediately, fixes the fire immediately. And allows me a lot more time to perhaps dig in and figure out what was it about that cluster that was an issue. Because the worst thing you want to do is try to do this root cause analysis while something is on fire. Like I don't know about you, but a lot of people don't perform the best under pressure, right? So the big thing is just get the system back into a state where there's no impact anymore. And actually, I skipped that earlier, but that's true for notification as well, right? You can imagine if you can be notified when something's going wrong. Generally, what happens is for systems, they don't cause issues. Generally, I'd say they don't cause issues unless a change is introduced in some way. The most common form of issues is when you make a change to a system, you deploy something new, you scale up a cluster, you scale down a cluster. And when you're making these changes and you notice something goes wrong instantaneously, perhaps even before triaging, you could know, oh, hey, I've just rolled out a new version of the application. I'm getting all 500s now. What's the first thing you think about doing is not to figure out why am I getting all 500s. You're like, let me undo that action as quickly as possible. And then let me, again, figure it out after the fact. And the third phase is really the root cause analysis phase, because a lot of what we talked about earlier is just undoing what you've done, or taking preventative actions thus that the system overall is healthy. However, you do need to find out what the root cause is at a certain point, right? Like if you do a bad deploy, you want to find out why you've rolled it back, you fixed the system, but why that deploy is bad, or like why that cluster is in trouble. And that's what root cause analysis is all about. Ideally, you do that not as the active issue is going on there, right? So, when we think about end users, generally it's these three things. It's in that order. And I would say that you don't have to go through all three phases. At any point in time, you can sort of remediate the issue and then step through the other phases there. And for us, it's a lot more effective to think about the problem like that, because it doesn't, for the end user, it doesn't push the problem down to produce all three data types, produce as much data types as possible. It changes the question a little bit into, okay, what is the type of data you need to produce from these systems to be notified effectively? What is the labels and the dimensions you're going to put on this data in order to triage correctly? So it changes the problem a little bit into how to produce the data for your outcome, as opposed to produce the data for the sake of producing the data there. I mean, it's a good practice to instrument. And what we often see in engineering organizations is almost a requirement to get promoted at a certain point is instrumentation, and it's a great practice to get into, right? But if you're just blindly instrumenting, like, what is the point of that if the instrumentation doesn't actually lead you to something effective? It's almost pointless. So that's the idea behind the three phases, and we just think, like, philosophically, it's a better way of viewing the problem. It's a different way of viewing the problem that is more focused on the outcome that you're trying to achieve, as opposed to perhaps the amount of data that you produce. And we say this as vendor that as people produce more data, it is better for the vendor for sure. But it's not the best thing for the end user, I'd say.
Yep.